Hey everybody, it's Durf, and welcome back to another episode of How to Make Mods for Scrap Mechanic. Today we'll be continuing where we left off in the last lesson. Last time, we learned how to create our first custom part, a dice. Today, we're going to be jumping into other kinds of custom parts, like a wheel and a wedge. But before we get into that, we're going to touch up on the last lesson to make sure everyone is on the same page. So last time, we ended up making a die, which is just a cube with individual UV mapping for each side of the cube. If you wanted to make a crate, for example, it's the same thing, but since the texture would be the same for each face, it's even easier to create. Dices and crates are very easy to make and very easy to change sizes. If you wanted to make a large dice or a large crate, you can scale your 3D model to any size that you want. Just make sure that your JSON code for the box collision matches the same size, otherwise you'll get something that looks weird. Some of you have already been experimenting since the last lesson and have already figured this part out. But real quick, I'm going to show you how easy it is to get a more custom size like the fruit and vegetable boxes in the game. It's really quite simple. Just follow the same process as before, but instead you can scale your model by individual axes, X, Y, and Z. Remember that your model needs to be centered on 0, 0, 0. This example shows a custom box size of 1 by 2 by 3, and for the JSON code, we can copy everything we used for the dice. Make sure to use a new UUID, reference your new model, and then set the appropriate box collision size according to what the model is. Here's another example that's 1 by 16 by 16. Or this one that is a 1 by 1 by 100 rail piece. Using the previous lessons and these tips, you can create any size that you want. For this lesson, we'll be moving at a faster pace since you should already know how to create your 3D models and textures. If you don't know how to create models and textures for Scrap Mechanic, be sure to check out the earlier lessons where that was already explained. We'll also have some mini tutorials to bring you through some more examples and teach you guys some techniques so that you can create any texture or model you need. But for today, we'll be focusing on expanding your knowledge of the JSON code for custom parts to make sure you guys know all of your options. So we're going to start with our 3D model of a wheel. Creating a wheel is very easy to do, it's basically a cylinder. In this example, we'll be creating a 3 by 1 wheel, the same size as the small wheel in the game. For the sake of consistency with Scrap Mechanic, I'm going to rotate the cylinder so the curved faces are on the X and Y axes, and the flat sides are Z axis. With your 3D model created and textured, let's take a look at the JSON code needed to bring this wheel into the game. We're going to start by copying everything we used for one of the boxes we made. Again, make sure you're using a new UUID for the new part, and don't forget to reference your new 3D model and textures. But this time, instead of a box collision, we're going to define a cylinder collision. Much like the box collision, we start by defining the property called cylinder in our JSON code. Cylinder is an object, just like box is, so we need curly brackets for this one. Inside the curly brackets, we define our cylinder with a diameter, depth, and an axis. Now this part should be pretty self-explanatory, just like the box collision was pretty simple, but just to make sure, we're making a 3 by 1 wheel, so the diameter of our wheel is 3, and its depth is 1. The axis property is used to define which direction the cylinder collision is to be applied, and if you remember our 3D model, it was made to be rotating about the Z-axis, so for the axis property, we put Z. Next, we're going to give our wheel a physics material and a density property with some appropriate values. You should already be familiar with these properties from Lesson 3, so I'm not going to go too much into the different options for them. Once that's done, we're going to take a look at two new properties for our custom object. The first is rotationSet, and the value will be the name of a rotationSet. A rotationSet tells the game which way an object can be rotated when you're building with it. Creating a rotationSet is pretty easy, but we're going to get into that in the next lesson. For now, all you need to know is that there are a lot of rotationSets already available in the game. So if you ever need your custom parts to rotate in a specific way, it is easiest to find an object in the game that already rotates in that way, then you can just look into the JSON code for that part and see which rotationSet it uses and use that one. For our custom wheel, we're going to use the same rotationSet as the small wheel in the game called PropYX. The next new property we're going to add is called Sticky, and Sticky is very important when it comes to making custom parts. Sticky will let the game know which sides of our object can have other parts attached to it. Just like some of these other properties, it's important to remember the orientation of our 3D model when defining which sides are sticky. In the last lesson, we didn't include a sticky property and the dice that we made worked just fine without it. This is because without a sticky property, the game will assume all sides of the collision are sticky. But for our custom wheel, we don't need the curved part of the wheel to be sticky, we just need the sides. So to do this, we put the directions that we need to be sticky as the value for sticky. For the model we created and the collision we gave it, we want to set this to -z and +z, so that both sides of the wheel can be attached to things and have things attached to it. And that's it. Combined with your knowledge from the previous lessons, that's everything you need to know in order to create a custom wheel. So let's save this, finish up the rest of the mod like the icons and stuff, and take a look at it in the game. Alright, here we are in the game, and in the inventory you can see our lovely new objects, but we're interested in the wheel. So real quick, I'm going to build a small car to show you that it works like a wheel. Now keep in mind that the 3D model is just visual. You can actually replace the 3D model with any other model later on. We'll probably do that in an upcoming mini tutorial, but for today's lesson, this model is fine. Now we're going to move on to another type of custom part in Scrap Mechanic, with new JSON code for its collision. We're going to be creating a wedge piece. So the 3D model we're going to be using is just a simple 1x1 wedge, and to do that we take a cube, select 2 vertices, and delete them, forming a wedge. As always, make sure your model has UV mapping before exporting. Even if you intend to use plain textures, the UV mapping is still required. With your new wedge model ready to go, let's take a look at the JSON code needed for this custom wedge part. We're going to start by copying everything we did for our wheel. Using a new UUID, we're going to set any other options that we also want different, like color, density, or physics material. Once that's done, we're going to define our wedge's collision, but we can't use box collision and we can't use cylinder collision either. So we're going to be using a property called hull. Now a hull collision is pretty easy to set up once you understand how it works. Hull is an object, just like the other ways to define collision in the game. So inside the curly brackets, we need 4 things. X, Y, Z, these are the outer dimensions of the collision, and then we also need point list, which will define a more precise collision shape based on the points listed. Basically, you can create any collision shape point by point and the game will fill in the rest. This is sort of like creating a 3D model point by point. But it's not a model you see, it's just a model that the game interacts with for collision. Really, box or cylinder collisions are available for your convenience, but a hull with a point list can let you get really precise with your collisions and sometimes produce some neat effects. Now if you remember our wedge model, it was a 1x1 wedge. It takes up the same space as one block. So for the X, Y, and Z of our hull, we set those to 1 each. This part of the JSON is exactly like box collision, so this part should be pretty straightforward. The point list is of course a list, so we need square brackets. For each point in the list, we use curly brackets, and inside each one, we need a coordinate for X, Y, and Z. The point list will define the vertices of the collision relative to the hull dimensions. This means that if you have a point in the point list with 0, 0, 0, that point is directly in the center of the part. That's not really useful for us since we need the object to collide on all sides. So what about a point at 1, 1, 1? Well, this is almost what we need, but in the wrong direction. It's actually quite easy to find the points you need, just keep in mind how you made your 3D model. For the wedge, we just need the outer corners. But remember, it's not the coordinates in the model, because these are points relative to the hull dimensions. So the points in the point list will always go from -1 to 1, no matter the size dimensions of the hull. The point list is like a location between -100% from the center and 100% from the center. It's pretty easy to think of it this way. Say you start on a point 0, 0, 0, the exact center of a part, and you go +1 in the X direction, +1 in the Y direction, and -1 in the Z direction. And we end up at one of the points of our model. So this is one of the points that we need in our point list to make this wedge collide accurately in the game. Now for the rest of the points. -1 in the x direction, +1 in the y direction, and -1 in the z direction. x1, y -1, z -1. x -1, y -1, z -1. x1, y -1, z1. x -1, y -1, and z1. With the points of our wedge collision defined, all that's left is to say which sides should be sticky. As you can see with our wedge model, we need both of the x directions to be sticky, the -y direction, and the -z direction. So in our JSON code, we put the sticky as -x, +x, -y, and -z, just like that. We don't need any other sides to be sticky because the wedge model isn't going to be touching anything on the remaining sides. That's where the slant is. So let's save this, finish up the mod, and see how it looks in the game. As you can see, now we have a custom wedge in the game and it behaves just like a wedge does. Now before we end the lesson, I'm going to show you how to create wedges of different sizes by creating a 3x5x9 wedge. Same as before, we're going to start by creating our 3D model, starting with a cube that is the size that we need, and then deleting 2 vertices to create our wedge. Make sure that the wedge has UV mapping, and don't forget about hard edges to make it look nice. Next, we'll copy all of the JSON code for the 1x1 wedge, and start our 3x5x9 wedge by giving it a new UUID and referencing the new model. We can leave the rotationSet and sticky settings as they are, since both wedges have the same orientation. This means the same sides will be sticky as the other wedge, and when building with it, it will have the same rotations available too. But for the hull collision, we need to redefine the outer hull to be 3x5x9. And here's where you really start to get an idea of how the point list works, because even with our new hull size of 3x5x9, our point list stays the same. Remember that the point list defines vertices for the collision hull relative to the size of that hull. When the point list shows a point saying x1, y1, and z -1, it is like saying 100% from the center on the z-axis, 100% from the center on the y-axis, and -100% from the center on the z-axis. This is because the point list is relative to the hull that is defined just before it. So let's save this mod and test out the new big wedge in the game. Alright, so here we are in the game, and here's our big wedge. It's looking mighty huge. And I'm not sure why anyone would want a wedge of this size. Perhaps it could be used for some architecture, or maybe access ramps or something. Besides just being able to make new parts in Scrap Mechanic, it also helps to think if it makes sense to make that part in Scrap Mechanic. So there's a little more to mod making than just what I'm showing in these videos, but you'll figure that out as time goes on. Don't forget about the inventory descriptions for the new parts that we just made. And with that, I think we've reached the conclusion for today's lesson. I hope you guys liked the video, and if you did, don't forget to drop a like and share this video with a friend. If you have any questions about what we covered in today's lesson, leave them in the comments below and I'll try to answer them as soon as I can. For even better mod making help, you can join my Discord with a dedicated mod making chat. Link will be in the description. This was part 2 of a 3-part lesson where we learn how to make custom parts in Scrap Mechanic. The final part is coming soon, and we'll be covering some additional JSON code not shown in this lesson, as well as some tips and tricks to create new parts that would otherwise be impossible in Scrap Mechanic. So it's going to be a very interesting lesson. Tutorial videos like this one are only made possible by the really awesome people that support me on Patreon. With their support, I'm able to dedicate the time that it takes to make these videos, and I wouldn't be able to do that without them. If you'd like to help with the production of more tutorial videos like this one, or maybe you just want to get a sneak peek on some of the mods I'm making, head on over to patreon.com/Durf for more information. And if you like this sort of thing and just want to see more, don't forget to go to youtube.com/Durf and subscribe. Thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye-bye!